Ava's greatest supporter. The sign read in elegant gold lettering. Beneath it was my mother-in-law's name, not mine. I stood frozen in the crowded hallway of Jefferson High School's auditorium, staring at the display until the letters began to blur. Around me, families laughed, took photographs, and adjusted graduation caps for excited seniors. The air buzzed with celebration. Parents carried bouquets. Grandparents wiped away happy tears. Everywhere I looked, people were preparing to celebrate years of hard work and sacrifice. So was I. Or at least I had been. Until I saw that sign. My name is Emily Brooks. I am 40 years old, and for the past 18 years, my daughter Ava has been the center of my world. I worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood. I missed vacations. I drove aging cars long after they should have been replaced. I stretched grocery budgets until every dollar practically begged for mercy. And I would have done it all again without hesitation because every sacrifice had been for her future. Today was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, I found myself staring at a sign that seemed to erase nearly 2 decades of motherhood. Mom! Ava's voice pulled me back to reality. I turned and saw her approaching in her blue graduation gown. Her blonde hair framed a face glowing with excitement. She looked beautiful. Older than I was ready to admit. "Are you okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. Of course. Her eyes followed mine toward the sign. For a brief second, confusion crossed her face. Then someone called her name from across the hall, and she was swept away by classmates wanting pictures before the ceremony. I watched her disappear into the crowd. The moment passed, but the feeling remained. Heavy, uncomfortable, familiar. Because the truth was, this was not the first time Margaret Brooks had tried to place herself at the center of someone else's accomplishment. My mother-in-law had a talent for making every event somehow revolve around her. Birthday parties, family reunions, holiday dinners. If attention existed, she found a way to stand in its path. Still, this felt different. Bigger. More personal. I approached the display again. Several signs lined the wall. Each honored a student and the person who had most influenced their journey. One recognized a father who coached youth baseball for 10 years. Another honored a grandmother who raised her grandson after a family tragedy. Then there was Ava's sign. Greatest supporter Margaret Brooks. I read it again. And again. Trying to understand how it had happened. Margaret loved Ava. That part was true. She attended birthdays. Sent holiday gifts. Showed up for occasional school events. But she was not the one sitting at the kitchen table helping with algebra until midnight. She was not the one packing lunches every morning before sunrise. She was not the one working extra shifts to pay for SAT prep courses and college application fees. Those memories belonged to me. Yet somehow standing in that hallway, it felt like they belonged to someone else. Emily. I turned to find Margaret approaching through the crowd. She wore an expensive cream-colored suit and a bright smile. Her silver hair looked flawless. Everything about her appearance suggested someone arriving for a celebration in her honor. "Isn't this wonderful?" she asked, gesturing toward the sign. "Ist er hier?" Wonderful. Her smile widened. Ava insisted on recognizing me. I told her it was unnecessary, but you know how sentimental she can be. Something about the sentence felt rehearsed, polished, as though she had already repeated it several times that morning. Before I could respond, another family approached to congratulate her. Margaret accepted their compliments gracefully. "I have always believed in that girl," she said. "I knew she would succeed." They nodded admiringly. I stood beside them, invisible, a spectator at my own daughter's milestone. The ceremony began 20 minutes later. Families filled rows of seats inside the auditorium. The stage glowed beneath bright lights. Ava sat among hundreds of graduating seniors, smiling as she searched the audience. When her eyes found me, she waved. I waved back. Then I noticed something strange. 2 rows ahead, Margaret was speaking with a school administrator. They seemed unusually familiar with one another. The administrator smiled and shook her hand warmly before walking away. Margaret looked pleased. Very pleased. A feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Small at first, then growing. Because suddenly the sign no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt intentional. And for the first time that day, I found myself wondering how many other things had happened behind the scenes that I did not know about. The ceremony should have held my full attention. Hundreds of students sat in neat rows beneath the bright stage lights. Proud parents filled every seat in the auditorium. The school band played softly near the front of the room. Every few minutes another camera flashed somewhere in the audience. It was the kind of moment families remember for decades. Yet I found myself distracted by a simple question. How had Margaret's name ended up on that sign? I tried to focus on Ava. Every time her row stood or shifted, I searched for her face. I remembered the little girl who used to sit at our kitchen table coloring with broken crayons while I paid bills late into the night. I remembered helping her sound out words during first grade. I remembered the science fairs, the soccer games, the spelling tests, and the endless school projects that somehow always required glue sticks at 10 o'clock at night. Those memories filled my mind while the principal welcomed everyone to the ceremony. 18 years. 18 years of small sacrifices that no one notices while they are happening. The extra shifts. The missed weekends. The canceled plans. The constant balancing act of work, parenting, and responsibility. Nobody applauds those moments. They happen quietly. One ordinary day at a time. Mom. My husband Ryan leaned toward me. You seem distracted. I looked at him and forced another smile. Just thinking. He followed my gaze toward Margaret several rows ahead. She was still chatting comfortably with various school officials. She does seem to know a lot of people here, he admitted. I nodded. That is exactly what I am wondering about. Ryan frowned slightly but did not respond. Like many people in the family, he had spent years learning that questioning his mother usually created more problems than it solved. The ceremony continued. Students crossed the stage one by one. Families cheered. Teachers smiled proudly. Then something unexpected happened. During a special recognition segment, the announcer began thanking individuals who had made significant contributions to student success. Several names were called. Volunteers, mentors, community sponsors. Then I heard Margaret's name. We would also like to recognize Margaret Brooks for her extraordinary support of graduating senior Ava Brooks throughout her academic journey. Applause filled the room. My heart sank. Margaret stood gracefully and waved. The audience smiled. Some people even turned toward her with admiration. I sat perfectly still. Ryan looked shocked. What is this? He whispered. I have no idea. But deep down I suspected that was not true. This felt too organized. Too specific. Too polished to be an accident. Margaret sat down again with a satisfied expression. A few rows away, I noticed Ava turning her head toward the audience. Even from a distance she looked confused. The moment passed quickly as the ceremony moved forward, but I did not miss the uncertainty on her face. Something about that gave me comfort. Because if Ava had arranged all of this, she would not have looked surprised. Nearly an hour later, the graduates finally received their diplomas. The auditorium erupted with cheers. When Ava crossed the stage, I stood immediately. My hands hurt from clapping. Tears filled my eyes. Nothing could take away what she had accomplished. Nothing. Not even this. After the ceremony ended, families poured into the lobby and onto the school grounds for photographs. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the campus. Everywhere I looked, people were hugging, laughing, and celebrating. Ava found us near the fountain outside the auditorium. Before I could say anything, she wrapped her arms around me. We did it, Mom. We. Not I. Not me. We. The word touched something deep inside me. You did it, I said softly. I am so proud of you. Ava smiled, then glanced toward her grandmother standing nearby with several relatives. Her expression changed slightly. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. Of course. She lowered her voice. Do you know why Grandma keeps telling everyone she got that recognition from the school? My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Ava looked genuinely puzzled. She has been saying all afternoon that the school chose her because of everything she did for me. But nobody from the school ever asked me about it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ava added something that made my pulse quicken. And last month, I accidentally saw an email from Grandma to someone in the administration office. It seemed strange at the time.
Ist daher.
What kind of email? Ava looked back toward the crowd where Margaret continued accepting congratulations. I do not remember exactly, she said slowly, but I remember seeing the words recognition committee in the subject line. That evening, after the graduation celebrations finally ended and the last relatives drifted home, I could not stop thinking about Ava's comment. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of cars passing outside. Ava had gone upstairs to change out of her graduation gown. Ryan sat in the living room sorting through photographs from the day. Every image showed smiling faces, proud expressions, happy memories being created. Yet all I could think about was that email. Recognition committee. The words kept replaying in my mind. Around 8 o'clock, Ava came downstairs carrying a cardboard box filled with graduation papers, programs, and keepsakes she had collected throughout the day. She set it on the dining room table and began sorting through everything. I think the email might still be here somewhere, she said. I looked up immediately. What do you mean? Ava pulled a folder from the box. Last month Grandma asked me to print something from my school account because she said she was having trouble opening an attachment. She shrugged. I remember seeing the email while I was printing. My pulse quickened. Do you still have it? Maybe. For the next 15 minutes, we searched through papers and folders. Most of what we found were ordinary school documents, scholarship, information, event schedules, graduation instructions. Then Ava suddenly stopped moving. Wait. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from the bottom of the box. I think this is it. She handed it to me. The page was a printed email exchange between Margaret and someone named Linda Foster from the school's recognition committee. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I started reading more carefully. My stomach tightened with every line. Margaret had contacted the committee herself. Not once, multiple times. She described her role in Ava's life in extraordinary detail. According to the email, she had provided emotional guidance, academic mentorship, and continuous support throughout Ava's educational journey. I read the words twice to make sure I understood them correctly. The version of events Margaret described barely resembled reality. She wrote about helping Ava prepare for important academic decisions. She described herself as a primary source of encouragement during difficult periods. She even implied that many of Ava's educational opportunities existed because of her involvement. None of it was entirely fabricated. That was what made it so effective. Margaret had taken small truths and stretched them until they overshadowed everyone else's contributions. Ryan walked over and read the page over my shoulder. His expression darkened. She nominated herself. Yes. The realization settled heavily over the room. Nobody from the school had independently chosen Margaret. Nobody had secretly interviewed family members and reached that conclusion. She had presented her own case. She had built her own narrative. Then she had accepted public recognition for it. Ava sank into a chair across from us. I knew something felt strange. She looked disappointed more than angry. I just did not expect this. I understood exactly how she felt. The problem was not that Margaret loved Ava. She did. The problem was that she seemed unable to separate love from recognition. Every meaningful event somehow became an opportunity to place herself closer to the spotlight. As the evening continued, Ava told us more about the weeks leading up to graduation. Small details she had not thought much about at the time suddenly felt important. Margaret repeatedly asked questions about ceremony plans. She wanted names of administrators, contact information, details about special awards and recognition programs. At the time, everyone assumed she was simply being an involved grandmother. Now those conversations looked different. Around 10 o'clock, Ava remembered something else. There was a teacher, she said suddenly. Mrs. Parker. I looked at her. Your guidance counselor? Ava nodded. She always knew how much you did for me. Ryan frowned. What are you thinking? Ava looked thoughtful. A few weeks ago, Mrs. Parker seemed confused when Grandma mentioned being nominated. My attention sharpened immediately. Confused how? Ava leaned back in her chair. She asked Grandma whether the school had changed its nomination process. At the time, I did not understand what she meant. Silence settled over the room. Then Ava slowly added, I think Mrs. Parker knows something. I looked down at the printed email still resting on the table. For most of the day I had felt hurt, overlooked, erased. But now another feeling was beginning to take shape. Curiosity. Because the more pieces we uncovered, the less this looked like a misunderstanding. And the more it looked like a carefully planned attempt to rewrite who deserved credit for my daughter's success. The following Monday morning I found myself sitting in the parking lot of Jefferson High School 10 minutes earlier than necessary. Summer break had not officially started yet, and a few staff members were still wrapping up end-of-year responsibilities. The building looked different without the crowds.
No balloons. No graduation banners.
No excited families carrying flowers and cameras. Just a quiet brick building beneath a bright June sky. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the entrance. Part of me felt ridiculous for being there. Another part knew I needed answers. Ava had given me Mrs. Parker's contact information the night before. When I called, the guidance counselor sounded surprised but immediately agreed to meet. There are some things I have wondered about myself, she had said. That sentence alone had been enough to keep me awake half the night. A few minutes later, I walked into the school office and checked in with the receptionist. The familiar smell of polished floors and old books filled the hallway. It reminded me of countless visits over the years. Parent-teacher conferences, college planning meetings, scholarship workshops, moments that Margaret often described as her own contributions whenever she spoke about Ava's success. Mrs. Parker greeted me warmly and led me into her office. Framed college acceptance letters covered one wall. Student photographs covered another. Ava's picture was there too. Seeing it made me smile despite everything. First, Mrs. Parker said as we sat down, "Congratulations. Ava worked incredibly hard." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of what she said, because of who said it. Someone who had actually witnessed the journey. "Thank you," I replied quietly. Mrs. Parker folded her hands together. "Ava mentioned you had some questions about the recognition program." I nodded. Then I explained everything. The sign, the public acknowledgement, the email Ava found, the nomination. Mrs. Parker listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. I was afraid that might happen. My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for a moment. This year's recognition process was unusual. How? Normally, students nominate someone who made a significant impact on their educational journey. I frowned. Ava never nominated Margaret. "I know." Mrs. Parker's answer came immediately. The room went quiet. "You know." She nodded. "Because Ava initially submitted a different name." For a second I forgot how to breathe. "Who?" Mrs. Parker smiled gently. "You."
Esther Tahir.
Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. Mrs. Parker opened a file on her desk and removed a printed form. She turned it toward me. There in Ava's handwriting was my name. Below it was a paragraph describing years of support, sacrifice, encouragement, and unconditional love. I recognized her handwriting instantly. I also recognized the tears forming in my eyes. "She wrote this." My voice barely worked. "Yes." Mrs. Parker smiled. "One of the most sincere nominations I received all year." I looked down at the page again. The words blurred slightly. Not because I could not read them, because suddenly everything made sense. Then why was Margaret recognized? I asked. Mrs. Parker's expression changed. That is where things became complicated. She opened another folder and carefully slid several documents across the desk. After the student submissions were collected, I began receiving emails from your mother-in-law. I immediately recognized Margaret's name at the top of multiple messages. At first, she simply wanted information about the process, Mrs. Parker continued. Then she began sending additional materials. What kind of materials? Letters, testimonials, personal statements. My stomach tightened. Mrs. Parker nodded toward the stack. She presented herself as Ava's primary mentor and educational advocate. I looked down at the documents. There were pages and pages of carefully written narratives, every one designed to position Margaret at the center of Ava's success. Did nobody question it? Mrs. Parker gave me a sympathetic look. Eventually I did. She paused. And that is exactly when things started becoming very strange. Mrs. Parker folded her hands and looked out the office window for a moment before continuing. The first thing that caught my attention was how determined she seemed. I glanced down at the stack of documents spread across her desk. There were recommendation letters, personal statements, and pages of detailed explanations. It looked less like a nomination and more like a campaign. Most families are grateful when someone is recognized, Mrs. Parker said. Your mother-in-law seemed focused on making sure she was recognized. I already knew exactly what she meant. The pattern felt painfully familiar. For years, Margaret had treated every family milestone as an opportunity to position herself closer to the center of attention. Birthdays, holidays, school achievements. Somehow she always managed to become part of the story. What happened when you questioned it? I asked. Mrs. Parker opened another folder and removed several printed emails. I asked for clarification. She slid one of the pages toward me. The message was polite, professional. She had simply requested additional information about Margaret's role compared to Ava's parents and other family members. Margaret's response arrived less than 2 hours later. I read the email carefully. The language was polished, confident. She described herself as Ava's primary source of guidance. She emphasized emotional support, mentorship, and educational encouragement. What struck me most was not what she included. It was what she omitted. My name barely appeared. Ryan's name did not appear at all. Reading it felt like opening a history book where entire chapters had been removed. Did she ever mention that Ava nominated me? I asked quietly. Mrs. Parker shook her head. No, a familiar ache settled in my chest. Not anger. Something sadder. The realization that Margaret had not simply wanted recognition. She had wanted ownership of the story. Mrs. Parker continued. At one point, I considered rejecting the nomination entirely because the information was becoming inconsistent. My attention sharpened immediately. What changed? The committee. She sighed. There were several people involved in the final review. Some believed her documentation demonstrated extraordinary involvement. Others felt the situation was unclear. I stared at the papers. And eventually the recognition was approved. The disappointment in her voice suggested she still questioned that decision. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then Mrs. Parker reached for another document. There is something else. She handed me a copy of Ava's original nomination form again. I wanted you to have this. My fingers tightened around the paper. Reading Ava's words a second time affected me even more than the first. She described late nights studying together. She wrote about watching me leave for work before sunrise, and still finding time to help with school projects afterward. She mentioned college applications, scholarship essays, and every moment I encouraged her when she doubted herself. There was no exaggeration. No performance. Just honesty. She wrote all of this herself? I asked. Mrs. Parker smiled. Every word. I looked down at the page again. Suddenly the sign at graduation seemed smaller than it had before. The recognition, the applause, the public praise. None of it changed what Ava actually believed. None of it changed the truth. Still, one question remained. Does Ava know her nomination was replaced? Mrs. Parker's expression grew serious. No, my stomach tightened. You never told her? I was not allowed to discuss committee decisions with students. She paused. But I always hoped the truth would come out eventually. I left the school nearly an hour later carrying copies of the documents. The afternoon sun was bright overhead. Students were cleaning out lockers. Teachers carried boxes toward their cars. Summer had already started for most people. As I walked across the parking lot, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Ava. Grandma invited me to lunch tomorrow. She says she wants to celebrate just the two of us. I stopped walking. The timing felt strange. Very strange. After everything I had just learned, the invitation seemed less like a celebration and more like something else. Maybe Margaret simply wanted attention. Maybe she wanted another opportunity to reinforce her version of events. Or maybe there was another reason entirely. I stared at the message for several seconds before replying. Have fun. And pay attention to what she says. A few moments later, Ava responded with a confused emoji and a short message. Why? I looked down at the folder in my hands. The answer felt obvious now. Because the more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Margaret had spent months carefully building a story around herself. And something told me that story was not finished yet. The next afternoon felt longer than it should have. Ava left for lunch with Margaret just after 11 o'clock. She wore a simple summer dress and carried the same relaxed confidence she had shown since graduation. Before leaving, she paused near the front door. "You are acting strange about this lunch," she said. I smiled. "Maybe I am. Do you think Grandma is planning something?" Considered the question carefully. "I think your grandmother likes being important." Ava laughed softly. "That is probably true." Then she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. After she left, I tried to focus on work. Emails, phone calls, household errands. None of it helped. My attention kept drifting back to everything Mrs. Parker had shown me. Ava's nomination, Margaret's letters, the recognition committee. Every piece fit together too neatly now. The only person who still seemed unaware of the full picture was Ava herself. Around 2 o'clock my phone buzzed. A text message from Ava appeared on the screen. "You were right." My stomach tightened instantly. Before I could respond, another message arrived. "We need to talk when I get home." That was all she wrote. The next 2 hours felt endless. By the time Ava pulled into the driveway, I was standing at the kitchen window pretending not to watch for her arrival. She walked through the front door carrying a small gift bag Margaret had apparently given her. Her expression looked different. Not angry. Not upset. Disappointed. "How was lunch?" I asked. Ava placed the bag on the counter and sighed. "Weird." I waited. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Grandma spent almost the entire time talking about graduation. My heart sank. What exactly did she say? Ava looked down at the table. At first it was normal. Then she started talking about how proud she was that the school finally recognized everything she had done for me. I remained silent. Then she started telling stories. Ava shook her head slowly. Stories about helping me succeed. Stories about guiding me through difficult decisions. Stories about making sure I stayed focused. She looked up at me. The strange thing was that some of those stories were not even true. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because Ava was experiencing the same confusion I had lived with for years. Relief because she was finally seeing it herself. "Did you say anything?" I asked. Ava nodded. I corrected her a few times. "And?" She laughed and said I was forgetting details. The words landed heavily between us. I knew that tactic. Margaret had always been skilled at reshaping reality in small ways. Never enough to start an argument. Just enough to make people question their own memory. Ava stared out the kitchen window for several seconds before speaking again. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why does Grandma keep doing this?" Her voice sounded genuinely confused. Not judgmental. Not angry. Just confused. I sat down across from her. "I wish I knew." Ava folded her arms on the table. "It is like she needs every accomplishment to become part of her story." The observation surprised me. Not because it was wrong, because it was exactly right. For the first time, Ava was describing the pattern herself. No influence from me. No suggestions. Just her own conclusions. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "There is something else." My pulse quickened. Ava unlocked the screen and opened a photo. I took this while she was in the restroom. The image showed several pages resting beside Margaret's purse on the restaurant table. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed the title at the top of one page. Personal Remarks. Another page read Recognition Speech Notes. My stomach tightened. What is this? Ava zoomed in on one section. I immediately recognized Margaret's handwriting. The notes described her influence on Ava's educational success, her sacrifices, her mentorship, her dedication. It read less like private reflections and more like a prepared narrative, a carefully practiced version of events. Ava looked at me quietly. "Mom, she planned all of this." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Ava added the sentence that changed everything. "And I do not think I want to stay silent anymore." Ava's words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. I do not think I want to stay silent anymore. For a moment, I saw not the little girl I had raised but the young woman she had become. Independent, thoughtful, strong enough to recognize when something was wrong. Yet I also knew how difficult the situation was for her. Margaret was still her grandmother. Family relationships are rarely simple, especially when love and disappointment exist. Side by side. That evening, Ryan came home from work and listened as Ava explained everything she had discovered during lunch. The restaurant conversation, the notes, the prepared remarks, the repeated stories that seemed to grow more impressive every time they were told. Ryan sat quietly throughout the entire explanation. When Ava finished, he rubbed his forehead and stared at the kitchen table. I honestly do not know what to say anymore, he admitted. Ava looked at him. Do you believe me? Ryan immediately nodded. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. I absolutely believe you. A small sense of relief crossed Ava's face. Over the next several days, our house settled into an unusual rhythm. Graduation celebrations were mostly finished. College preparations had begun. Friends visited. Family members called. Life moved forward. Yet beneath everything, another conversation was quietly developing. Ava kept thinking about what had happened. Every day she seemed to notice another detail she had overlooked before. One afternoon, while sorting through graduation cards and gifts, she suddenly laughed. Not because something was funny, because she had realized something. Grandma asked me 3 separate times who would be speaking during the recognition segment. I looked up from the laundry I was folding. Before graduation? Ava nodded. Weeks before. She shook her head. At the time I thought she was just curious. Looking back it felt obvious. Another piece of planning. Another step in a process that now appeared carefully organized from beginning to end. A few days later, Ava received an email from Jefferson High School. It contained photographs from graduation and a short message congratulating students on their accomplishments. Attached was a digital program from the ceremony. Most graduates probably would have saved it and moved on. Ava did something different. She opened it and started reading carefully. 20 minutes later, she walked into the living room holding her laptop. Mom! Something in her voice immediately caught my attention. What is it? She sat beside me and turned the screen around. Near the end of the program was a section acknowledging special recognitions. Margaret's name appeared there exactly as it had on graduation day. But underneath was something neither of us had noticed before. A brief description of the nomination process. Students were encouraged to nominate an individual who had made the greatest impact on their educational journey. Ava stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she looked at me. That was supposed to be your name. I said nothing. She did not need a response. We both knew it was true. For the next hour, Ava sat at the dining room table reading her original nomination form again and again. Mrs. Parker had emailed us a copy after our meeting. I watched as my daughter carefully studied her own words. The same words that never reached the recognition committee in the way she intended. Finally she looked up. I think I know what I want to do. My stomach tightened slightly. What is that? Ava took a slow breath. I want people to hear the truth. I immediately understood what she meant. Not revenge. Not embarrassment. The truth. There is a difference. How? I asked. Ava glanced toward the folder containing her nomination essay. My graduation party is next weekend. I had almost forgotten about it. Several relatives and family friends were planning to attend, including Margaret. You want to say something there? Ava nodded slowly. Everyone spent graduation hearing one version of the story. Her expression remained calm but determined. I think they deserve to hear the real one. For a moment the room felt very quiet. Then Ryan smiled softly from across the room. That sounds fair to me. Ava smiled back. Not triumphantly. Not dramatically. Just with the confidence of someone who had finally made a decision. As I watched her, I felt something I had not experienced since graduation day. Hope. Because for weeks the situation had felt like a story being told about us. Now for the first time it felt like a story we might finally be allowed to tell ourselves. The graduation party took place the following Saturday afternoon in our backyard. The weather was perfect for early summer. Blue skies stretched across the neighborhood without a cloud in sight. Folding tables lined the patio. Strings of lights hung overhead even though the sun was still shining. Friends, relatives, teachers, and neighbors moved through the yard carrying plates of food and cups of lemonade. Laughter drifted through the warm air. On the surface, it looked like every graduation celebration across America. Yet beneath the conversations and smiles, I could feel anticipation building. Ava seemed unusually calm, almost too calm. She greeted guests, accepted congratulations, and posed for photographs with the same warm smile she always wore. But every now and then, I would catch her looking toward the small microphone stand Ryan had set up near the patio. She had a plan, and she was waiting for the right moment. Margaret arrived shortly after 2 o'clock wearing a bright floral jacket and carrying several framed graduation photographs she had already printed. Within minutes, she became the center of a small circle of relatives. I overheard pieces of conversations as I moved through the crowd. I always knew Ava would succeed. She and I spent so much time discussing her future. Watching her grow has been one of my greatest accomplishments. The words sounded familiar now. Not because they were true, because I had heard versions of them for weeks, maybe years. Each story polished slightly more than the last. Each version placing Margaret a little closer to the center. I no longer felt angry listening to them. Mostly I felt tired. Tired of watching reality compete with performance. Around 4 o'clock, Ryan tapped his glass with a spoon. Conversations gradually quieted. Guests turned toward the patio. Ava stepped forward holding several sheets of paper. The sight alone surprised many people. Public speaking had never been her favorite activity. "Thank you all for coming today," she began. Her voice was steady. "I know everyone is here to celebrate my graduation, and that means more to me than I can explain." Smiles spread across the crowd. Several people raised their phones to record. Ava paused and looked around the yard. "The past few weeks have taught me something important." The atmosphere shifted slightly. People listen more carefully. Success never belongs to one person. She glanced down at her notes. Every achievement is built on countless acts of support that often go unnoticed. I felt my chest tighten. Something told me she was no longer speaking only about graduation. Ava continued. "People see the diploma. They see the awards. They see the finished result." She looked up again. "But they do not always see the early mornings, the second jobs, the late-night homework sessions, the sacrifices nobody talks about." The backyard became completely silent. I noticed several relatives exchanging curious glances. Margaret's smile remained in place, but it looked less certain than before. Ava took a slow breath. When Jefferson High School asked students to recognize the person who had the greatest impact on their educational journey, I knew exactly who I wanted to nominate. My heart stopped. Across the yard, Margaret straightened slightly. "I nominated my mother." The silence that followed felt enormous. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Just powerful. Ava continued before anyone could react. "I wrote about the woman who worked long hours and still found time to help me study. The woman who never missed a parent conference. The woman who encouraged me when I wanted to quit. The woman who believed in me before I believed in myself." I could feel tears forming in my eyes. Around me, people listened without moving. "Somehow that nomination never became part of the graduation ceremony," Ava said gently. "But that does not change what is true." Several guests looked visibly surprised. Others slowly began understanding exactly what she meant. Ava folded her notes and smiled toward me. "Mom, everything I accomplished started with opportunities you created. This diploma belongs to me. But the journey belongs to both of us." For a moment nobody spoke. Then someone began clapping. Another person joined. Then another. Within seconds the entire backyard erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. The kind that comes from understanding something important. I looked across the crowd and saw relatives wiping away tears. Teachers nodding. Friends smiling. And for the first time since graduation day, I felt completely seen. Not because people suddenly admired me, because the truth had finally been given a voice. And it came from the one person whose opinion mattered most. The applause seemed to last forever. Not because it was loud, but because it carried something I had not felt in a very long time. Recognition. Real recognition. The kind that does not come from signs, titles, or public ceremonies. The kind that comes from being truly understood. Ava stepped away from the microphone and walked directly toward me. Before I could say a word, she wrapped her arms around me. I held her tightly while the applause continued around us. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The guests, the decorations, the tension that had followed us for weeks. All of it faded into the background. "Thank you," Ava whispered. Tears filled my eyes. "You never have to thank me for being your mother." She smiled through her own tears. "I know." Around us, conversations slowly resumed. Several relatives approached one after another. Some offered congratulations. Others shared stories I had never heard before. One aunt told me she always admired how involved I was in Ava's education. A former teacher thanked me for attending every school event no matter how busy life became. Even neighbors who barely knew our family spoke kindly about the dedication they had witnessed over the years. The most surprising part was not what people said. It was how natural it felt. Nobody was praising me because Ava had given a speech. They were simply acknowledging things they had already seen for themselves. Across the yard, Margaret remained seated at one of the tables. For the first time all afternoon, she was not surrounded by a group of listeners. She sat quietly with a glass of iced tea in front of her. Her expression was difficult to read. Not angry, not defeated, just thoughtful. As the party continued, I found myself looking at her occasionally. For years I had imagined what it would feel like if the truth finally came out. I expected satisfaction, relief, maybe even vindication. Instead, I mostly felt calm. The truth had not destroyed anyone. It had simply corrected the story. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, I was carrying empty serving trays into the kitchen when I heard someone behind me. "Emily." I turned around. Margaret stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of laughter drifted faintly from the backyard where a few remaining relatives were finishing dessert. "Ava gave a beautiful speech," she said quietly. "Yes." Margaret nodded. "She is a remarkable young woman." "She is." Another silence followed. Then Margaret surprised me. I suppose I got carried away. The admission was small. Very small. It was not a full apology. It was not a dramatic confession. But it was probably the most honest thing she had said to me in years. I studied her face. For once there was no performance. No audience. No opportunity to impress anyone. Just two women standing alone in a kitchen. Why was it so important? I asked softly. Margaret looked down at the floor. Because I wanted to feel like I mattered. The answer caught me off guard. Not because it excused anything. Because it sounded painfully human. We all want to matter. We all want to feel seen. Somewhere along the way, Margaret had started measuring her value through recognition instead of relationships. And that choice had cost her more than she realized. Neither of us spoke again for several seconds. Finally, she nodded once and turned toward the door. "Good night, Emily." "Good night, Margaret." That was all.
No dramatic ending.
No perfect reconciliation. Real life rarely works that way. The weeks that followed were surprisingly peaceful. Ava prepared for college. Ryan and I helped her shop for dorm supplies. Family conversations felt lighter. More honest. Nobody mentioned the recognition program anymore because nobody needed to. The issue had already been settled by the person whose voice mattered most. One evening near the end of summer, Ava and I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Boxes for college were stacked inside the house. A new chapter of her life was only days away. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Always." She smiled. "I used to think success was about awards and achievements." I listened quietly. "Now I think it is about knowing who helped you become the person you are." I looked at my daughter and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not because she defended me. Not because she corrected the record. Because she understood something many people spend their entire lives learning. Recognition fades. Applause ends. Ceremonies become memories. But truth has a way of remaining. Long after the crowd goes home. Long after the speeches are forgotten. Long after the signs are taken down. And as I watched the last light disappear from the evening sky, I realized I no longer cared whose name had appeared on that graduation display. The person who mattered most had always known the truth. In the end, that truth was worth more than any recognition I could have ever received.